Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Kieran Setiya. He's professor of philosophy at MIT. He works mainly in ethics, epistemology, and the philosophy of mind. And today we're going to talk about his book, Life is Hard, How Philosophy Can Help Us Find Our Way. So, Dr. Setiya, welcome to the show. It's a huge pleasure to everyone.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So let me first ask you this. Talking about philosophy, what is really its purpose? If it has one single purpose, of course, because I'm asking you this because since in the book it seems that you're sort of applying it to more practical issues, or some of them at least more practical life, like how we should live our lives, how we should deal with some existential questions that might torment us and stuff like that. I'm asking you that question because I mean, at least in my perspective, philosophy wouldn't necessarily have to have some practical purposes or applications, right? Necessarily,
Right.
not necessarily.
Yeah. I mean, it's a big question. I would say at the highest level, I think of the purpose of philosophy as trying to come to a systematic understanding of and orientation towards the world.
Uh-huh.
And then if you think of the history of philosophy as one in which this initially all-encompassing project sort of gives birth to specific disciplines, physics, biology, psychology, sociology, linguistics, computer science, and they sort of have their own proprietary results and methods. Philosophy is left with the questions that are in some way methodologically infirm, the questions about understanding the world and orienting ourselves towards it, for which we don't have those kinds of proprietary methods. And for me, the goal of the book and the part of philosophy that I'm most invested in is about orientation to the world. So I think of moral philosophy very broadly, not just as being about moral obligation, but about how to feel and interact with the world and other people, with ourselves, the world and other people, and what kinds of emotional responses we should have to it, how we should guide our lives within it, how we should what kinds of things we should aim for. And I think that philosophy can and should contribute to our not just understanding what a well-lived life might look like, but to living better lives, to coming to terms with life in ways that are in a way continuous with the project of self-help on one understanding of self-help.
Mm-hmm. And talking about your book, what really makes life hard? Because if I understand it correctly, you go through several different topics in your book, and I guess that we can say life might be hard in many different ways, right? Like, for example, physically, politically, morally, existentially. So, I mean, but is there one single answer to this question about what really makes life hard or not?
I'm not sure there's one single answer. I think the answers that I dwell on in the book and that seem to me to organize an understanding of why life is hard have to do with our finitude or limitations and dependence. So there's the frailty of the body, there's our dependence on others, the fact that humans are not just social animals in the sense that a good life might involve social connection, but it's impossible to have an adequate life as a human being in a way that isn't dependent on other people. I think you could think of injustice or our ignorance of the universe as other forms of limitation and dependence that make life difficult, our limited control over the world. So I suppose the themes that unify the ways in which life is hard have to do with limitations of our bodies and our control, and dependencies on the world and other people that are not necessarily things to recoil from or reject, but forms of dependency that generate vulnerability. And it's that vulnerability, these kinds of vulnerability, that I think an approach to how to live, an approach to the good life, should never lose sight of.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that the kinds of experiences and life events and generally how we live life. But these experiences are universal across cultures, or do you think that some of them, and we'll get into examples, some of the examples you explore in the book, but or do you think some of them are culture specific?
I think there's a lot of cultural variation. And so some kinds of hardships like loneliness, some people experience in certain cultural circumstances might be much less problematic in others, much less prevalent in others. Or if you think of injustice, I hope injustice as a hardship of human life is specific to particular contexts, cultures, and societies, not something that's universal to human experience. And of course, the form it takes is specific to different circumstances. For me now, the climate crisis and climate justice is a kind of compelling source of moral and political concern, and that's not a universal condition. On the other hand, I do think there are aspects of human life that it's hard to imagine going away. So mortality and grief, our own mortality, the finitude of life, and the perennial possibility of loss, the loss of other people, those I think are unchanging features of the human condition. There are people who have sort of fantasies of technological uploading, or kind of imagine a world in which humans might somehow achieve immortality. But I actually think that those are fantasies that depend on misconceptions of personal identity and the fact that we are essentially a certain kind of mortal animal. We're not just streams of consciousness that you could sort of upload to the cloud and sustain forever. So in that sense, I think our animal nature and the limitations that come with it, those I think are universal to human experience and will remain universal.
And I guess that this also varies a little bit across individuals, right? For example, depending on people's personality, different people might find some experiences and some life events harder than others, and there are people who are more optimistic, others that are more pessimistic, and all of that, correct?
Yes, certainly. I'm sure that all of that is true. It's one reason why I think of this topic as in a way episodic, and the book is structured around a series of hardships: loneliness, grief, failure, injustice, the absurdity of the world. Is that I sort of imagine certain chapters will grip certain people more than others. There'll be particular hardships that are the defining ones for them, and the book is structured in a way that you could read it selectively. Although I do think there are deep connections between them. So maybe we'll talk about this later on. But I think that there are connections between thinking about hardship in one's own life and thinking about hardship in the lives of others, or between what loneliness tells us about what a flourishing life is like for a human being, and political and social concerns that have more to do with injustice, or similarly with failure. I think we can kind of connect the different hardships. So in a way, I think the entry point into thinking about the difficulty of human life will vary for different people, but many of the different hardships in human life are connected with one another in a way that I think can be fruitfully explored.
Do you think that we should try to avoid hardship as much as possible, or do you think we need to experience at least a little bit of it?
It's a good and I think really interesting and tricky question, because at some level it seems obvious that hardship is something to avoid. And occasionally maybe you need a little in order to have empathy for others or something, but who would deny that hardship is something to try to avoid? I think in a way there's two levels you could ask this question at. One is, should we try to reduce the amount of hardship in people's lives and avoid experiencing hardship? Broadly speaking, sure, yes. I think the way of avoiding hardship that is more dangerous is the inclination to turn away from hardship, to respond to hardship in our own lives or in the lives of other people by immediately trying to solve it or assure ourselves that it's all going to be okay, and not sit with it, not pay attention to it. So one central theme of my thinking about the fact that life is hard is that acknowledgement of the difficulties of life, a willingness to not avoid facing up to hardship, is very important. And it's very important both in building solidarity with others and because I think it's only really by paying attention in detail to the particular ways in which life is hard and really to our own lives and the lives of the people around us or the world around us that we can figure out how to orient ourselves towards those hardships. So how to engage with the world and ultimately how to change the world. In a way, I think we shouldn't avoid hardship in the sense of turning away from it. We should be open to it and willing to dwell on it in trying to live good enough lives, trying to live lives in which we're really engaged with the world in a realistic way.
So when we are confronted with hardship, do you think that we should complain about it? Is that a healthy approach to it or not? Or perhaps it might be healthy to a certain extent or in certain contexts and not others? I don't know.
I think the answer is yes, within reason. And this may be a case where one of the things you said earlier is relevant, that people's temperaments reasonably differ. But I have a certain kind of, I do think I certainly have a temperamental inclination to complain. And I think of complaining as a way of building solidarity and intimacy. So when I think about what is happening when I complain about something difficult in my life to friends, I'm not trying to bring them down. I'm trying to explore something that they may also have experienced. And often that moment of mutual recognition in which you say, oh yeah, I know what that's like, or I didn't understand what that was like, now I'm starting to get it, is, I think, an important form of human connection. I think it's also a source of consolation. I think being willing to talk about difficult things can be consoling, and refusing to talk about difficult things can make them harder to deal with, can create a sense of loneliness that exacerbates the difficulty of dealing with pain or suffering or grief or whatever it might be, or facing up to injustice in the world around you. So I actually think that there are many positive things about complaining, but there are also risks in complaining for its own sake, or in complaining in a way that isn't done with a view to this kind of solidarity and orientation that will enable us to go somewhere with the complaints, to find something positive in connecting around them.
Yes, I was thinking that perhaps it is good to a certain extent in the way that it might motivate us to try to change things and to participate more socially and politically, because if we go through hardships, we might develop some more compassion toward other people who also experience those same kinds of things and want to change things and try to avoid or try to make that other people do not have to go through the same kinds of experiences, I think. But on the other hand, and perhaps this would be more of a more stoic approach to things, and perhaps we'll get more into that later. I mean, there are things that, as the Stoics say, I guess, fall completely outside of our control, and just being able to accept that there are certain things we can't really do anything about, and not becoming resentful might be psychologically positive for us and also for the people we interact with, because if we become resentful or something like that, we might also mistreat other people, I guess.
I think there's a lot of truth in what you just said. I think there are a few things I would add to that, though. I think when we complain about the difficulty of life, one kind of positive thing that can come out of that is, in a way, instrumental. It's that we then do something about it, or we're able to find ways to make a difference to our own lives or to the lives of other people. And those things are definitely important. But I wouldn't want to downplay the consolation that comes from sharing difficulty with others, even if there's nothing you can do about it, even if nothing else comes of it. I think overcoming the loneliness of suffering by sharing your hardship, which often involves complaining about it, has a value in itself. It has a value of human connection, even if there's nothing you can do to change it. And I think, again, we might say more about the Stoics later, but I think sometimes protesting and complaining about things you can't change plays that role. It plays the role of forging solidarity and breaking out of one's own loneliness. I think sometimes it's also an expression of a kind of self-respect that not to protest about something, even when you can't change it, would be a kind of moral failure to properly register the terribleness of something, the injustice of something, regardless of whether that recognition is in fact productive in the future. So that's a point in which I think the Stoic doctrine that one shouldn't, as it were, rage against what you cannot control is really just a mistake about what a kind of morally serious and self-respecting orientation to the world would look like.
And when it comes to how we react to other people going through their own hardships, do you think we should pity other people in any way? Do you think that might be a good or a healthy reaction or emotion to experience?
I'm inclined to say yes. I don't think these distinctions are always drawn by ordinary language very rigorously, but philosophers will sometimes want to draw a distinction that I think is worth drawing between pity and compassion, where pity is in a certain way patronizing or condescending, and that I think there's a way in which pity could involve looking down on others. And I think that seems like a mistake. I think it's very important that when we recognize the hardships others are going through and feel compassion for them, that's a form of solidarity, not a form of distancing in which we put ourselves above them. I think a special complicated case of this is self-pity, where you might think, well, surely in self-pity, I can't really be patronizing or condescending to myself. But I think weirdly you can. You can, in being self-pitying, take a kind of lack a kind of self-respect, lack a kind of respectful attitude even towards yourself, and that there is a difference between self-pity and self-compassion, the kind of solidaristic self-compassion. So I think yes to compassion, some hesitation about the connotations of pity. I mean, this is part of a vision of what it would mean to live well, on which living well is really about living living as you should to the best of your ability. And living as you should means living as you should not only in relation to yourself, but in relation to other people. And compassion for the hardships of other people is a very important part of that.
So about living as you should, what does that really mean? What is a life well lived?
I think it's a very hard question. I think it's much easier to say, I hope, helpful things about what it's not than directly specify what it is. I think two distinctions are really useful here and very much orient the way I approach ethics in Life is Hard. One is the distinction between happiness as a state of mind and living well. And you could think, if you think of happiness as a state of mind, you could be happy regardless of whether you're engaged with the world accurately or not. Philosophers often imagine these wild thought experiments where someone, is the one person plugged into a simulation. They don't know it's being simulated, but it's all fake. They're not really interacting with the world or anyone else. They just have this stream of experiences. But the experiences could be very pleasant and they could feel perfectly happy, but they're not living a good life. They're barely engaged with the world at all. So I think there's an element to living well that involves not just how you feel or your state of mind, but engagement with the world and engaging with the world in the ways you should. I would say the second distinction or contrast here that is very useful in getting the focus of ethics into view is a contrast between the ideal life or aiming for what Aristotle called eudaimonia, and he was thinking of this. His vision of eudaimonia really was the highest good, a kind of a life free of deficiency in human need. I think that's another. It's a mistake to orient one's approach to one's own life through that kind of ideal, in part because it's almost always unreachable, but also because trying to get towards it when it's unreachable is often a source of further suffering and not actually a source of illuminating guidance about what to do with the difficult circumstances we always find ourselves in. So, those are both negative things. So what is a life well lived? Well, it's not an ideal life, and it's not just about your state of mind, your state of happiness. As to what it is, I think of it as a matter of engaging with the world, with yourself and other people, in as you should, to the best of your ability, and finding enough in life worth wanting, enough worth caring about, for you to engage in. I think there's an inherent vagueness in that, in this question of what really constitutes enough. But I think that's the predicament we're in. I don't think we can come up with the kind of clean lines that you might get if you were aiming for the ideal or for perfect happiness. I think those goals are misguided ones.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when people think about people who might have lived a good life and the opposite, people who might have really messed up their lives, I mean, it seems that the most extreme examples on one side or the other are the clearest ones, like, for example, exceptional people who lived really good lives and contributed to society in major ways and all of that. And on the other hand, people who really did bad and nasty things that are also exceptional, but exceptionally bad in that case. But when it comes to the vast majority of us common humans, it seems that there the question is more complicated and is not really clear who is really living a good life or a bad life, right?
I mean, I think it's true that those extremes often come to mind. Although I also find that if you try to focus, if you're in conversation with someone, try to focus on the question not who do you most admire or whose life would you do most envy, but of the people around you, who do you think is who you actually know? Who do you think is living well? Often people will find in their immediate circle examples of people who are, finding joy in often imperfect circumstances that they can point to as cases of living a good enough life. And that I think those examples are useful ones to have in mind. I think the temptation to sort of be drawn towards the ideal cases of excellence, it can be distorting. And it's distorting in part because there's a tendency there to shift from asking, as it were, whether someone is engaging with the world in the ways they should, sort of doing their best in the circumstances, to visions of excellence that are often sort of relatively detached from whether someone's ethical orientation is apt or appropriate. So often the people we come up with when we're asked who do you envy most are people will often come up with wealthy and prominent people, Elon Musk or Kanye West, who on reflection are from an ethical perspective may not be living particularly great lives. So I think that there are kind of multiple risks there in beginning with kind of ideals or exceptional cases rather than thinking, as it were, given the circumstances in which we find ourselves, which are always in various ways difficult, who's making the best of it and how are they doing that?
Yeah, also because we have to sort of have a realistic vision of people, because even the ones we tend to admire, it's not that they were perfect in every aspect of their lives. I mean, there are people who were exceptional intellectually, for example, but in terms of how they dealt with other people and even certain specific attitudes that they had in their life. I mean, some of them were straight out immoral in certain aspects of their lives, certain artists, philosophers, and all of that. So, I mean, I guess we have to be a bit also realistic about it, right?
Yes, no, I think that's right. And I think in sort of guiding your own life, to set as the model a kind of extreme, exceptional case, it's liable to be both unrealistic and in a way self-destructive, because the obvious thing to do when you set yourself that kind of model is to beat yourself up about the fact that you're not achieving it. And I think the tendency to do that, it has these deep philosophical roots. As I said, I think it goes back in one form to Aristotle framing his ethical thinking around an idea of eudaimonia, the highest good on which human life is sort of free from difficulty. He talks about sort of being pro-immortal, sort of don't accept the idea that being mortal, we should think of mortal things, but try to aspire to this otherworldly life. But you also find versions of it in, when you go to the Instagram pages of online influencers, what they're often portraying is an unrealistic and misleadingly perfect vision of what their lives are like. And I think many of us are familiar with the ways in which that kind of vision is not very emotionally healthy to have in mind when you're thinking about your own life. This is the kind of social media experience that leads to anxiety and depression and makes people feel bad about themselves. So I think for reasons that have to do with the philosophical, deep mistakes in the philosophical tradition, but also mundane experiences of dissonance that we experience when we're encountering the culture around us, we can get a sense of what's dangerous about focusing on ideals rather than the idea of the good enough.
Mm-hmm. So let's get into some of the specific topics you explore in the book. So starting with physical disability and pain. I mean, and here, when it comes to physical disability, when you talk about that in the book, are you just considering cases of people that have certain specific physical disabilities that they might be born with or develop in a very young age, or some that are more common, like the ones old people usually develop, and perhaps in that case the vast majority of us will suffer from some of that, even if only in old age, right?
Yes, no, so I think of the topic as expansive. So although a lot of the work I draw on when I'm thinking about, say, physical disability is written by and inspired by disability activists who often represent disability movements where people have been congenitally blind or are born with physical disabilities. I think that it is important to recognize that if we make it into older age, as many of us hope to do, most of us will confront various kinds of physical disability, various kinds of pain. And so I think physical disability and pain, and these forms of infirmity, are among the more pervasive kinds of hardship in human life, and ones that, if we're not dealing with them now, we should anticipate that we will in our lives. In a way, we should hope to live long enough to have to deal with them.
And about that, one very interesting thing that you explore in the book is if disability is a health issue or a political one. Could you tell us about that? What does that distinction really mean there?
Yeah, so I mean, I think in a way the answer is that it's both, but there's an interaction here that disability activists have been very attentive to. There's an idea that has gained currency in activist circles that if it weren't for the failure of social accommodations, most localized physical disabilities wouldn't prevent people from living good enough lives, the kind of living well that we were talking about earlier. And there's a lot of social science to support that. So the life satisfaction of people with physical disabilities is surprisingly, to many of us, it's surprising how little impact it has. And if you, say, become blind or lose the use of a limb, there will be a serious dip, but people will bounce back to a surprising extent. So there's a question what to make of that data and how to make philosophical sense of the idea that disabilities, which often strike us as a paradigm of harm, can be compatible with living well. And I think the philosophical foundations of this really come from a picture of the human good that is suitably pluralistic, that there's in fact so many ways to live a good life, so many aspects of so many different kinds of activity that can contribute to living a good life, that any good life is inevitably partial. There's always important forms of human good that are missing from the life of someone living well, living a good enough life. And when you have a physical disability, that becomes particularly targeted and particularly intense around a certain range of human goods. And that could be extremely difficult if those are ones that play a central role in your life. But in almost every case, there are enough goods in human life that you can find a way to live well despite that localized limitation. And that this is in a way continuous with the limitations that most of us face in our own lives with our limited capacities or the limitations that come with aging. So the way in which this becomes a political problem is when the social circumstances mean that a kind of localized disability that in principle is compatible with having enough good things in your life makes it very hard to access a wide range of goods. So, if you need to use a wheelchair to get around and there's no way to get ramp access to schools or theaters, it's not just that you can't, go for a run anymore. You won't be able to have access to education or art. So these social circumstances compound the effects of disabilities that might otherwise be localized enough in their effects to leave room for living well. And that's, I think, the sense in which there's a deep truth in the disability activist argument that disability is not straightforwardly a health problem, but a social and political problem.
Mm-hmm. So it's of course a health problem, but it is also very much a political one, right?
Right. The amount of control we have over how far these localized limitations expand to limit people's lives more pervasively. That's I think the right focus for thinking about what a kind of a society that treats people with physical disabilities justly would look like. And as you brought out earlier, the society that treats people with physical abilities justly is one that we all have an interest in, given that physical disabilities lie in the future for most of us.
Mm-hmm. Talking about loneliness now, what does loneliness really mean? I mean, is being alone, for example, the same as loneliness or not?
No, I think this is an important distinction you're pointing to, that you could, sometimes I'm alone in quiet solitude. I don't feel lonely at all. Or sometimes I'm in a crowd of people at a cocktail party looking around the room feeling terribly lonely. So I think a useful way to bring into view what loneliness is to think of it as the harm of frustrated social need. So to think of us as social animals who have a need for social connection, and loneliness is, as it were, the name of the harm or form of suffering that the frustration of those social needs induces. And I think that's really the thing we should be focusing on, not how much time people spend nominally in company with others or alone.
Mm-hmm. So if, for example, someone is an introvert, or if someone has some particular interests or some aspects of their own psychology they want to further develop that entail them spending lots of time alone, there's no problem about that. Right.
Right. I mean, I think this is another very important point, is that we are social animals and we have social needs, but they vary quite considerably on an individual basis. Different people have different degrees and different kinds of social connection they need. And we also have often a need to be away from society. So it's not, almost everyone needs some alone time too. This is why Kant talks about the unsociable sociability of human beings, that there's a kind of tension between these two needs, and the degree to which we have them is individually variable. Although I do think, even when you look at accounts of Trappist monks who have embraced a life of almost complete social isolation, they will, even ones who adjusted very well to that life, will talk about the ways in which it's difficult. That even those who have the most kind of hermetic approach to society still have some degree of social need, have some need for recognition or affirmation or interaction.
And what tend to be the negative effects of social isolation?
So this is an area where there's been a lot of very interesting social science, and I think that has been quite important, but there's a way in which I think it misses the point. So there's a lot of work about the health effects of social isolation and loneliness, and the health effects are similar to being seriously physically ill. People's mortality rates go up, their stress levels go up, and all of those things matter, and they should matter to public policy. But there's a way in which, if what you focus on in relation to loneliness is these ancillary health effects, you're sort of missing the key point. Like if I told told someone who was lonely, don't worry, there's this pill you can take that will take away all the health effects. I think that a reasonable reaction would be, yeah, but I also would like to have friends, or I would also like to connect with people and to interact with people. So at some level, I think if we understand friendship broadly enough, the negative effect of social isolation really has to do with the centrality of friendship, genuine connection with other people to a good human life, which is something that philosophers going back to Aristotle and his ethics have pointed to as one of the central goods of human life, friendship or connection. And that's, I think, deeply right.
By the way, since you're mentioning friendship, is it one single thing? I mean, does it have to be friendship like we tend to understand it in the West, where you share lots of things with your friends, even your psychological issues sometimes and the events of your life and all of that? Or can it be something more circumstantial or even sometimes more instrumental, where you have a particular goal in mind and you will cooperate circumstantially with some people to achieve it, and then you go your separate ways and you don't really talk about your personal life or share much about you and stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a case where pluralism, again, is the right view. And I think one of the challenges is I think we don't have a very good term that is suitably flexible for this. So I think, yes, all of the kinds of forms of connection that you described can meet our social needs. Like in a way, we could think of friendship here as a placeholder for forms of connection that mitigate loneliness. Although, for reasons I'll get into in a minute, I think that might be too broad. But yeah, so it could be what we'd ordinarily think of as friendship, but friendships come in many different kinds. But there's also family connections. We might think of parenthood, or your relationship with your parents, or your relationship with cousins, as not exactly friendship. It's a kind of kin or familial relationship. But insofar as it plays a role, often a central role, in the social connections that mitigate loneliness, well, we want to include that too. And similarly, romantic relationships might well fall under this heading. So yeah, when I talk about friendship here, I really don't have the perfect word for the breadth of connections. I think it's very important that the broadest possible definition is in a way too broad, because one of the insights into friendship that I think philosophy can give us is the continuity between friendship and forms of moral relationship that I think we wouldn't ordinarily think of as friendship, just forms of mutual recognition, respect, or compassion that don't seem to involve the kind of enduring bond or connections that
Right.
friendships do, but they nevertheless play a role in mitigating loneliness. So I think it can't quite just be anything that mitigates loneliness. It has to be something more durable and sustained than that.
Yeah, I asked you that because I mean, with the interest in mind of not excluding the many different kinds of friendships that might be out there cross-culturally.
Yeah.
There are many people that in different languages would call things friendship that are very different from our own Western sort of understanding of it. I mean, some of them don't even talk much about their own internal lives to their friends, for example, and they still consider them friends, right?
Yeah, yeah. So I wouldn't want to be prescriptive about it. I mean, one way to sort of get a bead on what is common to these different kinds of friendship is to think about the value of friendship or what's good about friendship, and to think. So here's a picture that I think is illuminating. We should think of friendship as built around, in a very broad sense, love, kind of loving connection, and of love in this broad sense as the appreciation in another of a value they have that's independent of merit, that doesn't turn on having to have any particular virtues or qualities that earn this reaction. That's in a way that how love is profoundly different from admiration or esteem. And if you think of love as the sort of deep appreciation of that, and friendship is involving a mutual appreciation, you get a sense of what these friendships have in common. And it may be that all kinds of different mutual interactions can afford the basis for a deep appreciation of someone else's value. And in fact, I think the value we're appreciating here when we, in the mutual love of friends, the value we're appreciating, this value that's independent of merit, is, I think, the very same value that we recognize in moral respect or compassion for others. So I think that there's a distinctive form of appreciation that's different from respect or compassion that defines friendship. But the value that is in view is very much the same value that our moral relationships bring into value. That's why I agree with the philosopher David Velleman has this slogan, love is a moral emotion. And I think he's right about that, because the value that it's responsive to is the very same value that's the basis of our moral relationships with one another. And I think this is actually quite illuminating of the ways in which even quite superficial forms of interaction that really just involve a moment's compassion or the expression of respect, respectful acknowledgement of another, can in fact mitigate loneliness. It's surprising how little it takes, how much less than sustained deep friendship you need in order to begin to mitigate the experience of loneliness that involves this sort of suffering of frustrated social need.
So talking a little bit about loss now, because I would imagine that this would be very much something that people universally experience. I mean, even if they don't necessarily attach grief to certain kinds of loss, everyone will lose something in their lives, like friends, romantic relationships, family, possessions, in extreme cases like war, even their own homes, for example. So what do you think is important to consider here from a philosophical perspective?
Well, I think grief is one of the cases where a distinction that I drew earlier in rather abstract terms becomes vivid and concrete, which is the distinction between being or feeling happy on the one hand and living well on the other. Because I think many of us recognize grief as a form of, grief is often sort of polyphonic and multivalent, but one thing it involves is often feelings of sadness or unhappiness.
Yeah.
But they don't seem to be straightforwardly in tension with living well, because the unhappiness of grief involves reacting in the way you should, which is to say painfully, to genuine loss.
Mm-hmm.
The hard philosophical question, I think, is not whether we should grieve. I think we should, and I think the kind of Stoic idea that grief is a kind of pathology to extinguish is wrong. I think the hard philosophical question is, okay, well, how to grieve, how much to grieve, how to grieve well. And I think, in a way, not to disappoint listeners, but to set expectations in the right place. I actually think this question is one that philosophy alone and reason alone can't really answer. I think one of the central part of our central need for practices of mourning has to do with the fact that just reasoning your way through grief isn't really possible, because the reasons for grief don't really direct us in how to grieve properly. Sometimes, when you look for the reasons for dealing with the world in a certain way, you have the reasons sort of tell you what to do. This is a case where the reasons tell you to grieve, and if you weren't grieving, you wouldn't be responding to the world as it is. But reason alone, I think, doesn't tell us how to grieve, and we need to accept maybe that we shouldn't grieve in a disabling way forever, but then, okay, there's a lot of room between not grieving at all and just grieving in a chronic way. How do we navigate that? And I think, that's something that philosophy alone is not going to equip us to do.
So going back to Stoicism for a second, we've already touched a little bit on it at the beginning of the interview. What do you think about it as a philosophy, generally speaking?
Well, there's a lot in Stoicism I find to admire, and I think there's part of what I think is really striking about it is that it has been useful to so many people. That's part of what lies behind the revival of Stoicism in pop culture right now. Mm-hmm. And so, insofar as it's bringing people to think philosophically about their lives, I think this is great. I do think there's something distorted about a central idea in Stoicism that has got a lot of currency now, which is the idea that you should simply accept what you cannot control, that your emotional response should be limited to the aspects of your life you can control, where the emotion is likely to be in a certain way productive. And when something isn't under your control, you should accept it. And I think grief is a case where I think you would be failing to register reality for what it is if you didn't respond with grief, even to the loss of, even to the loss of someone you love who you know perfectly well you cannot bring back, where it's something that you cannot change. There's an amazing moment in a review by the novelist Henry James of a new translation of Epictetus, this Greek Stoics handbook. Epictetus was one of the people who really drilled down on this idea that you should accept what you can't change. And Epictetus himself was enslaved. And one of his examples of simply accepting and not railing against what you cannot change is accepting his own enslavement. And what Henry James brings out is just how shocking it would sound to try to pitch that Stoic philosophy in the pre-Civil War South in America, to try and tell enslaved people, hey, you can't change this, you should not rail against it. There's a kind of moral self-respect that demands that we rail against injustice even when we can't change it. And I think some of this distortion comes from pulling Stoicism out of its historical context. So the actual historical Stoics had a kind of cosmological vision on which the universe was, to put it sort of in a caricature, was something like the mind of God. It was sort of Zeus was inherent in the cosmos, and that meant reason was inherent in the cosmos. So they had a kind of cosmological guarantee that everything somehow made sense in the end. And if you have that cosmological guarantee, I can see, it's much easier to see why you might think it's irrational to rail against what you can't control, because somehow or other it must all make sense, even if you can't see it. I think what's happening in the contemporary adaptations of Stoicism is that this idea of acceptance is being extracted from the cosmological, kind of wider cosmological theory that made sense of it. Since I take it most contemporary people inspired by Stoicism don't accept the cosmology. And I think you can't really make good sense of the Stoic emotional template, the Stoic emotional response to the world, if you really divorce it from a cosmology that most of us can't really take seriously now.
I would like to ask you now about something that, at least to some extent, takes us back to an earlier question I asked you when we were talking about what is a life well lived. So there's this idea nowadays it's very prevalent nowadays that to some extent we measure the value of human life by what people are able to achieve. That is, we have some expectations about what people should achieve in life, what they should get, what they should be doing with their lives. And isn't that, or can't it be a problem, thinking like that?
I do think there are several kind of problems here. So I think one of them has to do with the way in which we can be inclined to understand our lives in terms of a single narrative project, a single narrative arc, and that kind of focus where you think my life is defined by this project, it's risky because if you fail, you may end up feeling like a certain failure defines you as a failure. But it's also risky because, or just mistaken, I think, because focusing too narrowly on one project can blinker your ability to appreciate what's good in life. I mean, this goes back to the pluralistic sense that if you try to account for what a good life is like, the answer is, well, there's a whole lot going on. All these relationships and little activities and little successes and failures, that's where the goodness of a life is to be found typically, not in terms of the one project by which some heroic figure might be defined. I mean, the other part of it is to do with the structure of achievement as such. So, achievements, thinking of your life in terms of achievements is focusing on the activities that are projects. They're ones that are aimed at something in the future that you're trying to achieve. You don't have it yet, so that's frustrating. And then the moment you have it, that's done, and you have to move on to the next project. And your engagement with projects aimed at achievement is in effect a kind of self-undermining of the sources of meaning in your life. Yeah. So when you engage with a project by trying to complete it, you take something meaningful and you try to extinguish it. You try and kick it out of your life. And I think that it's very important to see that not all of the activities that have value in our lives are project or achievement-like. There's also ongoing process-like activities like parenting or thinking about philosophy or having certain kinds of relationships or spending time with friends and creative projects and artistic engagement that don't have this project-like structure, or at least have a value that's independent of what they achieve. And I think we really risk missing that when we think of our lives primarily in achievement-based terms.
And also, isn't it important to sort of reflect a little bit on how we measure success or achievement? Because, for example, if we go to some extreme cases like people that are part of what some people call the hustle culture, where it's just about productivity all the time, being productive, and it's usually measured in terms, your success is usually measured in terms of how much money you earn. I mean, there are many extremely valuable things and activities that people can participate in that do not involve earning any money whatsoever, that are extremely valuable. Like you mentioned, parenting. Other examples would be helping other people in any meaningful way, like being a volunteer at a homeless shelter or something like that, right?
Yeah, no, so that's exactly right. I mean, there's a very interesting history of this that is told by the historian Scott Sandage in a very provocatively titled book called Born Losers, but in which he traces this idea that your life is to be defined by a single enterprise, and specifically an economic enterprise, to the Americans. He traces it in America to the post-Civil War period, and two, a period in which the idea of a kind of credit report or that your economic entrepreneurship was a defining badge of your standing as a human being. And so I think that particular version that the achievement success paradigm takes has kind of particular historical roots, and that it's still extremely powerful, that those are the most socially salient ways to gauge whether someone is a success or a failure. And I think stepping behind that to try to think about the variety of projects and the alternatives to project-based structuring of one's life, this more process-based orientation, what I call an atelic orientation, because it's not focused on the telos or end or achievement. I think these are cases where sort of philosophically reflecting on the structure of the activities that matter in your life can help to push back against the social imposition of single-minded economic standards of success. It's also a case where I think there are limits to how much you can do, as it were, by individual philosophical reflection. I mean, really, the roots of this are social roots. So ideally, what we would want, I think, here is a shift in how society is organized so that money is less central, and a shift in the way we think about education and what we're educating people for, on which where the goals of education have more to do with, or so framed in terms of, a richer vision of a flourishing human life than educating for the needs of the 21st century economy, which is how very often politicians frame what education now is about.
Right. So talking about injustice now, because that's another big thing people care about when it comes to how they associate life with hardship and the complicated stuff people have to deal with in many different instances. So what does injustice really mean? Because if I understand it correctly, in the book you talk about different kinds of injustice, right?
Yeah, so one of the things that I am very focused on there is the idea that we should think about injustice less in terms of what political philosophers call ideal theory, where you start with a kind of utopian vision of a just society and say, oh, well, how are we falling short of that? And more in terms of recognition of concrete injustice around us. And often the injustice we see around us is what Iris Marion Young and other political theorists call structural, meaning there may be particular unjust actions or policies out there, but what's sustaining the patterns of injustice goes beyond that. That even if people weren't, say, even if there weren't racial prejudice or particular racist policies, it may be that the historical organization of America, in fact it is, that the historical organization of US society means that the way education operates, or the way how the housing market operates, or the way the job market operates, systematically disadvantage certain groups, and that emerges interactively without any particular people needing to do anything overtly racist. So I think one of the insights philosophy can give us here is the concept. It's sort of conceptual resources like the concept of structural injustice in which to make sense of the injustice of the world around us. This is in a way continuous with what I said before about the importance of paying attention or acknowledgement, the idea that reflecting on and sitting with difficulty in order to sort of philosophically articulate it is a sort of crucial part of figuring out how to come to terms with or how to change the hardships of human life.
So for the last part of the interview, I would like to ask you about some more existential questions. I mean, some of these are things that perhaps philosophers care more about than most people. But when it comes to things like existentialism and absurdism and all of that, so one of the questions that really bothers some philosophers a lot is the apparent lack of meaning in life. So But does it really matter that much if life does not have any meaning at all?
I think that's a hard question. And in some ways, I think I don't directly answer it in the book because what I spend a lot of time doing is trying to make sense of this question. What is the
Hmm.
meaning of life? Which
Yeah.
philosophers sometimes dismiss as nonsensical. They say, well, meaning means, what has meaning? It's like a sentence has meaning, or what has purpose? Well, a part of a system has a purpose in the system, and we shouldn't think of life as having a semantic meaning like a sentence or being part of a system. So,
Right.
what is this even question? What is this question even about? And
Hmm.
I think we can make sense of the question, what is the meaning of life? When we ask what is the meaning of life, we're asking for an interpretation of life, human life, humanity's place in the universe, that helps to orient us towards it, telling us, as it were, what it's all about, how to make sense of it, and therefore how to feel about it, and ideally how to accept or be reconciled to it. And the anxiety about absurdity is the idea that there is no answer, there is no such interpretation, there's no way we ought to feel or no way to make sense of things. Do we need an answer to that question? I think in a certain way, I think for certain purposes, probably not. So one thing I think is very important for clarifying what's at issue is to draw a distinction between the question of what it takes for an individual life to be meaningful or for an individual to have a meaningful life. Basically, the question of what it means for someone to have a life well lived. And the question we're now focusing on, which is really about the meaning of life as such, not something that varies from person to person, but it is a kind of cosmic question. And I actually am not sure that in order for individuals to have meaningful lives, there needs to be an answer to the question, what is the meaning of life, let alone that they need to have that answer. So in a way, once you've distinguished these two questions, there's a way in which you can say, no, individual people can have meaningful lives, even if life as a whole has no meaning. So in that sense, we don't need life to have a meaning. On the other hand, the fact that this question is gripping and that it's a question that religions answer and that religions have a kind of satisfy some kind of deep need that we have suggests to me that as well as being social animals, we are, as it were, spiritual animals. And so we do have a kind of existential need to ask this question and a craving for a kind of answer to it. As with social needs, it probably varies from person to person how deep that need is and how disturbing it is to them individually not to feel like they have an answer to the question, what is the meaning of life? But I do think a kind of flourishing life for the kind of being we are often does involve asking this kind of question. And in that sense, I think it really does matter whether life as a whole has meaning.
Of course, there are people who take this question to sort of an extreme and try to look at things from the perspective of the universe. And of course, from that perspective, I don't think we can say human life has any meaning whatsoever because, I mean, we are tiny, very, very tiny on the scale of the universe. And also, if we look into the very long future, I mean, eventually, probably humanity will go extinct at one point or another, and probably the universe itself will also disappear in one way or the other. But so, I mean, looking at things from that perspective, there really doesn't seem to be any meaning at all in human life. But perhaps that's not exactly the point of view we should adopt here. I don't know.
I mean, I think one way to see how there could be meaning is to think about, say, well, look, we're going to go extinct at some point. Um, it seems very disturbing to think about that as being imminent. I mean, I think people do have a sense, react with a sense of horror to the idea that that humanity will go extinct in the near future. We want humanity to go on, but it's got to be possible for human life to have meaning, even if we go extinct at some point. Otherwise, the sheer fact that we go extinct would mean it was all meaningless, which I don't think is quite right. I think a way to try and bring into view how it could be that humanity has a kind of cosmic meaning, even in the face of our ultimate extinction, is to think about the question, should we respond differently? Should we feel differently about different narratives of human history that end in extinction, but in different ways? So a very important contrast here for me is the contrast between a narrative of human history on which over many generations we make progress towards justice, and then, ultimately we go extinct, maybe, through some kind of illness, or we become infertile, or whatever happens. But we deal with it we sort of face this circumstance with compassion for one another in a way that respects one another's dignity. That's one possibility. Another possibility would be, faced with the climate crisis, we end up in nationalistic violence and war, and humanity goes extinct in circumstances that are kind of morally awful. And I think we should feel very differently about those two narratives of human history. And what that suggests is this question: how should we feel about human history as a whole? It's a perfectly good question, and there are answers to it. And some of those answers are ones that should, in a certain way, reconcile us to or help us to accept human history. So if we make progress towards justice to the best of our ability and then humans go extinct, I think we should say, well, no, that's the best we could have hoped for as human beings. We weren't going to go on forever, and look at the progress we made. If instead we go extinct under circumstances in which our potential is so far from being realized, in which we're sort of morally still at odds with each other, in which we're unable to treat each other with dignity, that will be terrible. And we should respond to that with, in a way, a kind of species shame, a sense of horror at how humanity has ended up. So I think that contrast illustrates that the question, what is the meaning of human life, not only makes sense, but could have positive answers or negative answers. It's just that the answer depends on how human history goes, which means on the one hand, we don't really know the answer right now. On the other hand, that in a certain way, to the limited degree that we have control over how human history, that's to say the human future, goes, the answer to the question, what is the meaning of human life, is up to us.
Mm-hmm. So one last question then. Considering all of the different kinds of hardship people usually go through and experience throughout their lives, what is the role that philosophy can really play here? I mean, in what ways can philosophy perhaps help us deal with that? And do you think that really philosophical arguments and argumentation in general can convince people of how they should appreciate life, or perhaps deal a little bit better with life and with hardship, or not?
I think there are real limits to how much argument can really do here. So, in relation to, say, injustice, there's a philosophical ambition of arguing people into caring about others, into caring about justice. There's Plato arguing that in the Republic that there'd be a kind of disorder in our own souls if we weren't just towards other people. Or Kant arguing that morality is somehow something we must, a kind of imperative we must prescribe to ourselves in order to be autonomous or fully achieve freedom. I don't think those arguments really work. So I think in those cases and in others, I'm not sure philosophical argument is going to do as much as some philosophers have hoped in making our lives, helping us to live better lives. I think this is part of why in engaging in philosophical reflection in this book, I shift to a mode that's more descriptive and talk about myself, talk in a more memoiristic way, because I think a central part of ethical reflection is this attentive acknowledgement of difficulties in life, and that we should think of the kind of attentive description of, what is bad about pain, or what is bad about disability, or what is bad about loneliness, as a philosophical task that orients us towards those hardships and gives us a sense of how to deal with them more constructively, even if it doesn't take the form of a kind of classical philosophical argument. So I suppose my answer to the question is, in order to see how philosophy can be helpful, we may need to expand our vision of what philosophy is, so that more non-argumentative modes of philosophical reflection are in view, and that philosophy becomes more continuous with memoir and literature and poetry and other forms of literary and humanistic engagement. And I think that's not just true of difficulties like pain or loneliness. I think even when you look at something like the concept of structural injustice, and you think, why is that useful? How does that help us? A very big part of what's happened there is, in a way, a kind of conceptual innovation, coming up with a new concept through which to see society. Then there'll be arguments that follow in its train. But to some degree, that kind of conceptual progress is akin to the kind of thing that happens when a poet has a kind of metaphor that enables us to see the world differently. And I think those kinds of contributions that are not straightforwardly argumentative can be a central part of how philosophy helps us deal with the fact that life can be hard.
Well, perhaps with that in mind, the more heterodox, non-conventional styles of writing by philosophers like Nietzsche would be helpful here, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think philosophers should play with the form of philosophical writing more than they have done, and I think also with the form of philosophical talks and lectures and seminars. And I think that kind of that the point of that is not just a kind of playfulness or entertainment, but that those shifts in form are shifts in and expansions of our conception of what philosophy can be and do, sometimes returning us, as with Nietzsche, to visions of what philosophy can be and do that were more prominent earlier.
Mm-hmm. Great. So the book is, again, Life is Hard, How Philosophy Can Help Us Find Our Way. I'm leaving a link to it in the description box of the interview. And Dr. Setiya, just before we go, apart from the book, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Well, the easiest place to find me remains Twitter for now, I think, at Kieran Setiya. And that has links to my webpage and the book and my podcast. I also have a Substack newsletter called Under the Net. So if you just search for Kieran Setiya as Substack, you should be able to find it. And I post little reports on things I've been reading recently, and then mini philosophical essays, sometimes about novels, sometimes about aspects of life that I think philosophy can help us come to terms with, and sometimes about nonfiction or art that has caught my eye.
Great. So thank you again so much for taking the time to come on the show, and I really loved talking to you.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing and to keep the channel sustainable, please consider supporting it on Patreon or PayPal. The links are in the description box of this interview. And if you like this interview, please share it, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check the website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Karen Litska, Blanchett Perga, Larsen, Jerry Mueller, Hans Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Herbert Gintis, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Visser, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Henry Kalenia, John Connors, Philip Force Connolly, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Mark Neves, Colin Holbrook, Simon Columbus, Phil Kavanagh, Jorge Pinha, Michael Stormir, Samuel Andrea, Francis Forte, Tiago Nunes, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Harl Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stanton Tanti, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego António Correa, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pablo Stazewski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litska, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Morton Eichland, Dr. Bird, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Mau Maria, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Ruth Towell, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Amaury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Pedro Bonilla, Ziegler, João Barbosa, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Harringman, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassis, Tom Roth, DRPMD, and Igor N. And special thanks to my producers, Izar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Tafinia, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Hughney, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Robert Lewis, and Alnick Ortiz, and to my executive producers, Michel Rugieski, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.